Hello, DJ News. Welcome back. So in this session, let us talk about label extensively. All right, let's talk about everything we know about label. Okay, and label is one of the form elements. When you're actually creating a form, label is one of the form elements. We have seen input type, the input element. Okay, so in this session, let's take a look at label element. The label element, okay, in HTML is used to define a label for an input element. Okay, you use it to define a label. Like you define a label, you give it's like you're giving it a name. Let's say you have an input element where you want to take in people's first name. You can give a label first name to that input. So we are going to see how it's being done. It provides a user-friendly way to associate descriptive text with form controls. It improves accessibility and usability. So one way or why you should also always use labels is because of accessibility. In as much as we have not discussed accessibility we have not talked about accessibility, but you understand accessibility is for people who have disabilities who can't really read. All right, so they need accessibility. So whenever you're creating your web page as a professional, accessibility is something that you must always consider. Okay, so you use label for your input elements and other form controls to give a descriptive text for that element. So what is the syntax like? All right, the label element is used with form controls like input, text area, select, and etc. Okay, so how does it how do you write it? This is how you write it. And whenever you write it, you use the label input, and these are attributes. These four attributes, all right, must be is you have to always use it. Okay, there are other attributes too, but this four attribute is the most important. Okay, so now if you can see this label now, all right, the four attribute is pointing to the ID of this text of this input element. All right, this is how you write it. The four attribute has to point. So this label, what element is it for? So this label is for this input element. So you can see the ID of this input element of this input element is the same thing with the value of the four attribute here. Okay, so it must always go like this. All right, so if we go to code, let's see what we have. Okay, let's say we have a label like this. This is how you write a label. You can just say username. Okay, then you would have to use the four attributes and give it the ID. Let's say we can just say username. Okay, and we are this label, which element is it for? It is for input element, and this input element has an ID of the same. It has to be the same thing with the four value of the four attribute up there. Okay, so this is the minimum I can actually give you. So if I run this code now, you're going to I open with live server. This is how it is. All right, this label element is for this input. Okay, so this label element is for this input. So this is how you actually put it. You would always have the ID of this element. Okay, let's say we can also have more. I can just put a break. I can put a break, and I can have another element. Let's say username. I can now have for password. Okay, I can say this is for the password. Okay, and this will be this will be password. And since the four value here, the value for the four attribute is password, I also have to give this element the attribute, the ID of password, and also the type would be password. All right. So if we go on and go to the browser now, this is how it looks. Okay. So if I click on, look at it, if I click on this label username now, look at what happens. You see, the input element that is for the label is highlighted, has focus now for you to type. If I also click on the password, you can see the password has the input for the password has been highlighted, has focus. If I go back and remove the 4 attributes of this password, let me say I just make a mistake. Okay. If I go back now, all right, if I refresh, if I click on this password, okay, sorry, didn't I save? I didn't save. That was why it was still working. I didn't save. So I save here. I go back. All right. So if I click on this password, you see the input is no longer highlighted because I didn't point this label to the input element. So you can see one of the reasons why you should use the for. So somebody can just, instead of me clicking on the input to start typing, I can just click on the label. If I click on the username, you can see the username input element gets focus. Okay. So this is why you should use the for element. The 4 attributes, sorry about that. So I will take this thing back. All right. Okay. So let's go back to our slide. Now, let's take a look at some of the key attributes. I have already mentioned the four attributes. The 4 attribute associates the label with a specific input element. The value of the 4 attributes must match the ID of the input element. So which input element do you want to associate the label with? All right. So the thing that they have in common is that the 4 attributes, the value of the 4 attributes should be the ID of the input element. Okay. So we also have, now this is an example, you have already seen that. Okay, you have already seen where we did password, we did for username, and we also did for password. Okay, so we also have implicit association. If the input is placed, this is something we call implicit association, and this is what you have already seen. Okay, sorry, we haven't talked about it. Sorry about that. Okay, so if the input is placed inside the label, the association is automatic and the 4 attribute is not needed. So what we mean by implicit association is this. Remember, for you to associate a label to an input element, you have to use the 4 attributes, but that is explicit. But if you want to make it implicit, you would have to put the input element inside the label element, and you don't need to write in the label, as in you don't need to use the 4 element attribute again. So I can actually come here and use, okay, I can actually okay, I can actually, instead of, I will remove the 4 attributes. Okay, and instead of having this keyword there, I could just do something like this. Okay, I can still leave it. Okay, I'm coming. I can still leave I could just take this thing out and place it here. And I can actually say, I can say email. All right. And in short, I wouldn't even need the ID anymore. I don't need the ID anymore because I am not using the for. So if I save now and go to the browser, you can see this is automatic implicit associativity. If I click on the email, now remember I did not use the 4 attribute, but if I click on the email, you can see it also gets focus. All right, because of what? If you want to do implicit associativity, all you have to do is make sure that your input element, whatever input element, is inside of the label element. All right. So with this way, you don't have to use the 4 element in case the 4 is something too much for you. You don't want to be typing too much. I think for me, this should be the best way. I like this one. Okay. I just like it because I would type less. All right. And typing less is amazing in coding. Okay. Typing less is amazing. All right. So now this is what we call implicit associativity. Now we are no longer using the 4 attributes, but we are still having that association. Okay, so this is what we have already seen, implicit association. All right, so you can put the input element or whatever element that you want to associate the label with. You can put it inside the label, and you don't need to use the 4 attribute anymore. Okay, so title is also another attribute. It specifies additional information about the label, usually displayed as a tooltip when the user hovers over it. So if I go now and add attributes to title to this one, I can say your username. I can just say your username. So I have given it title. So if I go back to the browser, if I take my mouse over it, look at it. You see, that's the tooltip. So the title here is serving as a tooltip. So a user can, if you want to add more information, maybe you want to give more description, okay, on how to improve users' experience, you can actually use this. So when the user takes their mouse over it, it serves as a tooltip and they can see what you have written there. So this is how it works. So you can see the title for this label is enter your phone number. All right. You can give it any title at least that can help the user to use the application better. So now we talk about improving accessibility. How do we use label to improve accessibility? Like I said before, we haven't talked about accessibility, but already I've been mentioning what accessibility is, but we are going to take a very deep look at it when we talk about it in this one chapter, okay? So how do you improve accessibility with label? Okay, using label enhances accessibility by allowing screen readers to identify the associated input field. Okay, so whenever you have input fields, text area, and other form controls, you always have to use label always, because it will improve, it would enhance accessibility, and it will allow screen readers to actually identify the associated input field. So label is something, whenever you're creating your forms, label is something you must associate with other input, other form controls that you're using. Always use your label, please. All right. It makes you a better developer. This is what professionals do. Enhancing your accessibility, the accessibility of your application makes you a better developer. So clicking the label also focuses the associated input. We have already seen when you have this association with the input, either you use the for attributes or you use the implicit association by putting the input element inside of the label. It's when you click on the label, it focuses the associated input, which is especially useful for radio buttons and checkboxes. We would also talk about radio buttons. We'll talk about checkboxes in details in their own sessions, okay? So how do we use the label with different inputs, okay? So we'll take a look at, we have seen this one already, all right? We have seen this one. We are working with the normal text input. We can also use it with checkbox. We have not talked about checkbox yet, but you can also use it with checkbox. So I can actually go back now and say one of these inputs could be okay, let me just turn this one to checkbox. We'll talk about checkbox later, okay? So if I just go, I'm not going to talk too much about this. So this is what checkbox looks like. So if you see, because it is for this checkbox, if I click, it's checking, all right? So this is how you use it. Although we'll still talk about checkbox, all right? We'll talk about checkbox. So you can use it with checkbox just the same way. Either you use the for attribute to associate it, or you use the implicit association. You can also use it for radio buttons. Okay, all you have to do is to change the type to radio. When we talk about for every element we are going to be working with after this session now, we'll be using labels, okay? Because you have already seen that it is a very good practice for you to be using labels for your form controls, okay? When I say form controls, I mean the elements you use inside a form, okay? So you can actually have, okay, radio button like this. So I'm not going to talk about this radio button because we haven't talked about radio buttons yet, okay? So, but we talk about radio buttons in subsequent session in extension, okay? So what are the best practices of using label? Always use a label for accessibility and usability. Always use a label for accessibility and usability. If the label is not visually necessary, hide it using CSS while keeping it accessible. Now, if for some reasons it is not necessary for you to actually have this label, all right, the advice they are giving us here, the best practice is this: still use the label, but you can hide it. Okay, let's say I have this label. I can use CSS and I can hide it. Display, I can use the display none. Okay, now it is still accessible, all right, but the user will not see it, but it's still accessible for screen readers and stuff like that. So if we go back here now, we are not going to see it. The password, we no longer see it. Okay, we no longer see it. But for screen readers, okay, they will still see it. So best practice is that even though there is no need for you to use label, you can put the label and hide it with CSS. Okay, but you still keep it accessible for accessibility. All right. So use a clear and descriptive text for the label to help users understand the purpose of your input of the input. So since you're using label for inputs, use descriptive text for the label. It will help users to understand the purpose of the input. So what are the common issues with label? They're missing the 4 attributes. This is a common issue. Some people actually will miss this 4 attributes. Ensure the 4 attribute is correctly linked to the input ID. Ensure whenever you're using the 4 attribute, ensure that it is correctly linked to the input ID. Avoid using duplicate ID values for multiple inputs. Imagine that we have duplicate values for input. Let's say now, this label is for this ID. Let's say I have another ID. Okay, let's say for this password now, the ID is also username. So we have duplicate ID. We have this input ID as username. We have this one also as username. So if I save this now and go to the browser, if I click on the label, which one is it associated to? All right, let's see. Okay, seems like it takes the first one, but you can say it is confusing. All right, it is very, very confusing. So avoid it. All right, moreover, no two elements should have one ID. No two elements should have one ID. So always avoid duplicate IDs. Okay. And thank you very much. This is where we end the session. Please write your test, do your assignment, and I'll see you in the next session.